Hello and welcome to this episode of Business on the Wire. This one, of course, is a working from home episode that's coming to you. I hope everyone is staying indoors, not stepping out unless it's essential, and taking care of both your hand hygiene and those that may be more vulnerable in your families. I wanted to talk a little bit about the kind of economic package or the kind of economic support that one should and ought to expect from the government in the light of what's happened with the COVID pandemic. Economically, let's look at the options that are presented before the government. And before that, I know there's been a great deal of criticism about why the government has not acted yet. To give them the benefit of doubt, this is still an evolving situation. We are moving a little bit behind the curve in terms of what's happened in the European nations already in terms of the spread of COVID. Having said that, I think it is now a matter of hours, not days, before the central government must speak and must set out at least 3 or 4 key pillars or blocks under which it intends to put out any kind of support, financial and otherwise, for organizations, enterprises, and most importantly, individuals. Growth numbers have already been lowered by rating agencies. Frankly, I think that's a bit of a moving target and quite ineffective at this point. You can say it's 4%, but it might be lower, it might be a smidge higher. We really do not know. So I think it's quite ineffective talking about growth targets and what that gets sliced down to. What we need to talk about now is the concrete numbers and the kind of support that can be sent out. It's also clear that, especially with the lockdown that now exists across most districts or most key business districts in India, this is going to hit the services space very, very hard. And I just want to go through a couple of sectors and the support that could likely come or should likely come for those sectors. The first thing, of course, is to understand what exactly is getting hit for a company or an enterprise. One is what's happening with your sales and profits. I think CII has already put out some numbers which show that for the survey of 300 companies across sectors, they said that order books were down, supply chains have been disrupted. So the first impact for a company, of course, is what's happening with revenues and profits. The second part of the problem is what happens with workers' wages and with their jobs. How hard is that going to be hit, and how can that be indemnified, not from the workers' point of view, but from the organization's point of view? In aviation, for example, the aviation body CAPA says that the demand may dip between 40 to 50% in the near term. Air India, Indigo, GoAir, they've all already announced salary cuts of between 5 to 25%. There are global examples such as with Virgin, where employees have been sent on leave for 8 weeks without pay. The government has stepped in India and said that you cannot do that, but I think some tweaking in terms of workforce is probably coming after this COVID event. A few things will come out of it. Privatization for Air India, for instance, could be delayed. That means the government will have to step in and provide some interim funds, and almost immediately that could range between $400 to $300 million, depending on what the nature and use is at that point for Air India. There have been some suggestions to do something with ATF or aviation turbine fuel, to bring that under GST, to look at weekly revision. Frankly, I think these are very, very small measures. They may help the sector at some basic level in terms of their taxation relief, but I think for the aviation sector, a very large package will have to be thought of in terms of supporting, most importantly, this workforce layoff scare and threat, which is a very real threat. It's ditto for the tourism and entertainment sector. The industry body says 38 million job losses will occur directly or indirectly. Movie theaters are reportedly losing between 2 to 10 lakhs per day when they are shut down, depending on how large they are. There are other sectors, of course, that have seen collateral damage. The poultry sector, for example, which went through this wave of panic saying, that's where the COVID impact was coming from. That space, because of how small it is and how small the players within that industry are, certainly need a lot of hand holding and some kind of safety net financially, or there are going to be a number of enterprises that fold up. For business and industry as a whole, there are sweeping measures that need to be considered. A temporary GST holiday, extending the financial year and extending the time given for people or for organizations to, file taxes. And this is also where the RBI comes in, quite frankly. It is surprising that the Reserve Bank has not moved with as much alacrity as several other global central banks have. Rates need to be slashed, and they need to be slashed aggressively. The RBI has to dive in and act at this point. Time is of essence indeed. for smaller businesses, which is really the big pain point, I think, within India's entire business environment, the MSMEs, is where we need to put out very specific lines of relief. Smaller businesses need relief on working capital cycles, they need fresh credit lines, they need schedules for repayment. For example, for the government to say that all salaries will be protected, and that addresses a large swath of labor, is fine, but who protects the small and medium enterprise, and who protects them from a complete shutdown or the fear of a shutdown? So I think lines of support have to move down and they have to move up as well. The risk of financial contagion is frankly quite real. Companies going into bankruptcy and then creating a domino effect for other companies. So I think contagion is the other thing the government must sit down and think about quite carefully now. This brings me to the biggest worry of all. My biggest concern is what COVID is doing at a very granular and individual level, and what's happening to the individual employee across organizations. I'm not talking about the large 20 or 25 corporates that may even be reflected on the Indian stock indices or happen to have large offices in Mumbai and Gurgaon. I'm talking about the images of the migrant laborers standing at railway stations across the country, struggling to get into that last train to make it home, where there may not be any guarantee of income either. Some analysts have made the point that this is a good time for universal basic income. It's time to bring that in, and I have some serious differences and concerns around that. Just working with the universal basic income, it may simply take too much time, effort, and work from the central bank to get that going. A good and ready example is the PM Kisan scheme that happened most recently. It's a clear example of how long it took the government before the scheme actually kicked off. It took a couple of months before transfers actually made it to individual accounts. Large scale schemes like this are also notorious for being leaky taps, where you just don't know whether the intent may be great, but you just don't know whether it is reaching the last person in that food chain or supply chain, which is why I'm not a big fan of introducing universal basic income now. I think logistically it is just too large a thing to take on. It also means, by the way, shutting down several other subsidies and schemes to avoid double counting, and I think that's a messy and time-consuming exercise. I just want to run through the numbers of individuals that we're talking about. PLFS data for 2017-18 indicates that 25% of our labor force is casual workers. That's close to 11.62 crore people. I think the first step is advancing rations, PDS supply, all that needs to be boosted. Pensions, of course, can be front-ended. Those are the one or two logical steps for the central government to go to. But that ensures people don't go hungry. It doesn't compensate for their income. Another way to go about this is to, of course, pump money, like I said, into the PDS, but also into the MG Narega scheme. I think that one will have to, be brought to life and really livened up over the next couple of months to ensure there is some form of employment provided, especially in the rural part of India. I just want to walk through some of the state level support as examples for what the center could look at. In Uttar Pradesh, the chief minister has said he's going to give 1,000 rupees to all daily wage laborers and construction workers. Just to put this number in perspective, PLFS data shows that median earnings are around 250. So 1,000 rupees is basically 4 days worth of salary for them. It's clearly not going to cut it in terms of support. The Odisha government has decided to grant PDS and pension entitlements in 3 months in advance. Kerala has set out some good examples that could be emulated at the central level. The total package that's been set out is 20,000 crore. Most of it is basically just front loading their spending, which is something the center will have to think about. And of course, it's been allocated to different categories. 2,000 crores goes for consumer loans, over 1,300 crores for welfare pension. The health area gets a large package of about 500 crores. Delhi has announced a package specifically for COVID as well. Globally, there are examples of what's been done to help individuals out. For example, France and Denmark are waiving, rent and utility bills for a couple of months. The problem in India is enforcement. Can we really ensure that every tenant gets that kind of support and gets that kind of waiver in terms of rents? I'm not so sure, and I also think that implementing that is not going to be that easy at all. There's also a different concern compared to what we're looking at in Europe. And I think many of us tend to, because we have access to so much global information, say, oh, look what's happening in France and Italy. I think the problem for the individual, especially the daily wage laborer or even the lower economic strata labor, is very, very different in India compared to what they're going through in developed countries. They do not have that much access to either, food and basic supplies, neither do they have any kind of work from home model at this point. So we have to think much larger, and we have to think organic to what it is that India's basic problems are and the strata that is impacted the most. I also want to make a quick point about what's happening largely in the backdrop of having gotten here. In February this year, India's savings rate plunged to a 15-year low. Household savings also declined as consumers actually spent more on purchasing durables and traveling. That means all of that is beginning to crunch down given what's happened with COVID. Navigating this crisis is going to be, even more crucial than any of the shocks India has borne, whether it's demonetization or GST. And most importantly, remember, we are working with 7 quarters of a slice down in growth already. We are not in great shape. I think the equity market is reflecting some of that trauma, if you may, with the kind of bloodletting that's happening and the kind of adjustment that's happening on leverage and on positions. The government will need to act with empathy. They will need to act with largesse. And I think the government needs to now work on an immediate basis, especially when we are dealing with a particular economic strata that may or may not come out of this in fit shape at all.